All right, Robin Shepard is a guest tonight. She's on Zoom. She has been busy at work creating a movie about amateur radio and has a quick talk about it, wherever Robin is.
Robin, you need to unmute your microphone. There you
go. You got to unmute yourself, Robin.
There you go.
I'm here. Okay, I'm really
Okay, great.
Awesome.
All right, so we had to kind of switch things up because Josh here was running late, and he actually has a very, very good excuse, and he can tell us about it. But thanks, Josh. So we're moving Robin up front first, so Josh isn't stressed out here. But a few months back, I was emailed by Kristen as well as Robin on a cool project. So before we go any further, let me just run the trailer, and then we're going to come back, and then we can talk a little bit about that. So let's roll it.
The oldest radio in my collection was homemade with a little wire cat whisker to help tune it, and you could pull music out of the air from the stations around you.
The challenge for us as expedition operators is to work as many people in as short a period of time as we have available. There's a thrill to that. When you first open up, everybody comes out of the woodwork calling you.
I think the most satisfying thing is actually building the gear, getting it to work, and actually being able to use it as a ham radio operator.
A mentor is mostly known as an Elmer. I prefer Elma. Elmers are always out there to help.
I became involved with the American Radio Relay League, and I found myself as director. I'm honored to be able to try and shape the future of amateur radio.
I see so many hams that are part of great emergency operations.
We see time and again that during the first critical hours of a disaster, that ham radio is the only thing that gets through.
The Amateur Radio Relay League has coined the phrase, when all else fails, ham radio. And every ISS has a number of hams aboard. That's a testimony as to how important communications is using ham radio.
Ham radio has been recognized for years as being a lifesaver for a lot of people.
And amateur radio is fun. You always are learning, and you're always giving back. And the people that you meet make it fun.
Okay, I think we're good there. Wow, that's a pretty good trailer, huh? So the actual documentary, if that's the right term, is a bit longer to show here. And so I was so glad that Robin was able to provide a trailer for us. So without further ado, Robin, let me start off with some question of maybe you could tell us about who you are and your background, and then what prompted this video to come up.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. It's great to be here. I think it was 2018, 2019. I was doing some moonlighting as a journalist, which I've done since the 1990s. And I ended up interviewing my neighbor who is involved with CERT. And in the process of learning all about the amazing stuff that CERT volunteers do, I, of course, learned about ham radio volunteers. And that's how I met Heather Lee Takuchi at San Benito Amateur Radio Club. And she was very gracious and just really kind of opened my eyes about it. And it kind of just brewed in my mind until COVID. And I do historical documentaries. I'm now doing 2 a year. I used to do 1 a year. And I kept thinking about it, kept coming back up for me, ham radio. And it turned out that several of my fellow Rotarians, I'm a Rotary Club member in Morgan Hill, I started finding out that I had ham radio people all around me at Rotary. And I ended up meeting Eric Hilding, who is a longtime ham radio operator and a fellow Rotarian in Gilroy. Kristen McIntyre, I was introduced to by Heather Lee Takuchi. And then I met Jim Tripp, who is so amazing. He has this amazing ham radio / radio museum. He's got like 1,000 radios and has done a lot of volunteer work. And what I ended up finding in putting this together, and it is a documentary, these are all their accounts of their experience. I very specifically tried to reach out to men and women from different cities, different clubs, who really have kind of their own passion for ham radio, their own type of involvement. So each one of them approaches it from a slightly different angle. And they were incredible to interview. And we went down to see Jim and Heather Lee down south. I'm in Morgan Hill. And then we got to talk with Kristen McIntyre. Stanford very graciously let us use their ham radio station to do the filming. And that was thanks to John Four. I don't know if any of you know John, but he's the ham radio station director there. And we met Dave Leesom, a longtime high-tech, visionary, and also longtime ham radio operator, another very passionate person. So we were just so fortunate to meet these amazing people. We learned a lot, and I just want to spread the word. So we showed it in December in Morgan Hill. And then we got invited as a selected film to show our film at the Poppy Jasper Film Festival, which is now, it's every April, and it's now in, I think, 4 cities. So Morgan Hill, Gilroy, Hollister, and San Juan Bautista. So that's the only reason it's not actually online viewable right now. It is about 50 minutes, which would have been a long view for you tonight. So I appreciate being able to show our little commercial trailer. But I went ahead and I just, I'm so thankful for your clubs and being so welcoming to me that I just, I purchased a handful of tickets. I have 5 tickets that I'd really like to be able to donate to 5 people from your club who know they can attend and are committed to attend. It's on April 14th at 5 p.m. in Morgan Hill. And I'm happy to send this information to Rob so he can share it with you. I have the tickets, and again, very excited about it. Kathy Zellman is on this Zoom. She's my executive producer. She's the past president of the Morgan Hill Historical Society, and the Historical Society is kind of like the host of the films, but Kathy and I go out and get grant funding for every film we do, and now we're doing 2 a year. So it's a busy thing, but it's a labor of love. And I'm just, again, I'm so impressed by ham radio operators. And I ended up creating this little flyer for the movie poster, and I put Kristen's son on the poster because she told a great story about having him get involved as a teenager in his first time working Antarctica. And so I put him on here because I know that, to be able to get this in front of young people and have them realize how much fun this can be and all the potential ways that people can be involved is something I would love to help with. So I'm sorry I went so long here, but I'm just really, I'm very impressed by the culture of the ham radio community. And I admire you, and I want to do what I can to kind of just get it out there in front of some people who might not normally hear about it.
Thank you so much. And by the way, I went ahead and printed those tickets out. Well, let me change screens here real quick. There you go. And I have the QR code. So what I'll do is if I have some takers here, I'll make sure I mark those down to let you know. And yeah, commend your efforts. And I have to reiterate to the audience here and on Zoom that between the 5 people there, that was very well diversified in all the areas of ham radio, and you did a great job. So thank you very much for what you did and all your coworkers on this project.
Thank you. We did drive down to San Benito. Heatherly invited us to come and present to their club, so we did that, and we'll try to do a few more. But I'm really hoping that ARRL will help us get the word out too. And again, just thank you so much for your time. And if you are one of the people who comes down to the film festival, I will of course be there and would love to meet you.
Well,
Thank you, Rob.
All right. I don't know if we have a lot of time for much questions, but if someone's got something super pending from here or, okay. Thank you so much, Robert. We got to move on, but.
Bob, would you introduce our speaker, please?
Okay, man, we're running around left and right this evening because we got a lot of content for you. So I was looking for meetings earlier in the year, and this is Josh, KO's ASM. There we go. And he told me that put me on his list if I needed somebody, and lo and behold, the opportunity came up. So I'm sure all of you saw the blurb on online. Unfortunately, there was a little bit of an error on the newsletter. That was from a year ago, but no problem. You're all here. And, we've got a terrific guest speaker. This is a cool topic, and I was fascinated because we all do DF and fox hunts and stuff like that. Now, here's a different twist, and I'm just curious to see how it parallels from kind of a Civil Air Patrol search and rescue kind of point of view to from a fox hunt point of view. So we'll pass it over to Josh here.
Ooh, hello. All right, everyone, right now. Incoming.
Juggle.
All right. So good evening, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to speak tonight. I am tardy. Actually, I guess it's relevant to tonight's topic. There was a bad accident on 280 and I stopped to give first aid. So we'll be talking a little bit about that tonight. So it took me a little while to finish up with the highway patrol. So
Great excuse, guys.
I'm
Great
going
excuse.
to start off with a video of an aircraft crash. And I'm just giving everybody a little bit of a warning. There is a little bit of blood. It's not graphic, but if there's anyone uncomfortable, just raise your hand and I can skip this if that's okay. Awesome. We'll start with that then. Here we go. It's from up in about northern Idaho a few years ago.
Just love what digital cameras do to a prop blade.
It's a state park. You can fly in. It's a great place to go. I've been there myself. Grass strip, beautifully situated up in the mountains. And this is a pilot here, actually in the left seat is a very experienced Army helicopter pilot. You'll notice that they're having a little trouble getting off the ground. They landed early in the morning when it was nice and cold, and they're trying to take off about 1 to 2 in the afternoon. And he's taking off towards rising terrain. If you notice that every time he pulls the nose up, the plane sinks back towards the ground.
What's the field elevation there?
Field should be, this is about 3,700 feet. But it's summer and hot, right? So air gets thinner. And so that right now it's probably acting like it's about 7,500 feet.
Oof.
And he's got 3 adults on a 55-year-old airplane.
Oh my.
Doug, what's the airplane again?
I don't recall the make model. I've got the accident report on my laptop.
Okay.
And at this point, he's out of options. He had
Yep.
Up at this here in this part of the country, there's no radar service. There's really no one, there's no air traffic control. So no, he's not talking to anybody. So you can imagine if he'd been out here flying, nobody around, nobody he could be declaring an emergency to, no one that would be following him on a radar or wondering where he was. He hasn't filed a flight plan.
Oh, Lordy.
I'm going to fast forward a little bit because it takes a while for them to get themselves out of the airplane. But just look at their expressions on their faces. There are 3 individuals who are in bad shock right now.
Did they have an ELT?
It did not activate in the crash. Believe it or not, that was not violent enough to activate an ALT, even though they fell all the way to the ground.
Wow.
Having a remote switch is actually kind of rare. It's a fairly modern.
Yeah.
Oh God, look at the mess of that plane.
So I'm here to talk to you tonight about, let me share the next part of this. Slide one. All right. Talking about how we find aircraft that have gone missing, and basically how radio plays an important role in finding and rescuing downed aircraft, as well as a variety of other things, missing ships or sunk ships, and missing hikers. So a little bit about me. Born in the US, moved overseas when I was just about 6 months old. My family was in Saudi Arabia for 20 years. No high schools where we grew up. So went to boarding school in England. Was one of the first Americans allowed to be an exchange student in Russia just after the Soviet Union fell apart. Came back, started a company right out of high school, sold that, went to college, went to BYU, majored in computer science and business finance with a minor in linguistics, played baseball for BYU. Spent 2 years in Ukraine as a missionary for my church, won a scholarship to Oxford, took a master's degree there. Did another company, sold that to Microsoft, and then was at Microsoft Research for a decade, Amazon for a decade, running advanced research and development there. And then 2 years split between OpenAI and Scale AI, and then took some time off, and then running one of the AI orgs at Meta now. Parallel, I'm an officer in the Navy Reserve at one of the SEAL teams. Been in the, doing that for for over a decade. About 3 combat deployments, and so that's sort of my background. A number of years ago, I've been flying. There's only so much you can do as a civilian pilot. You can go out for lunch and you can come back. You can do the bay tour. It kind of gets boring after a while, and look for an opportunity to do something with that. And like many of you who've gotten involved in certain other things, it's kind of fun to take your hobbies and apply them. And so Civil Air Patrol is the auxiliary, the civilian auxiliary of the US Air Force. It operates the largest fleet of single engine piston aircraft in the world. Here in the Bay Area, for example, we've got 7 squadrons. We have 5 aircraft responsible for search and rescue, disaster response. We transport blood, organs, search and rescue dogs. Just before the Super Bowl, we were responsible for flying to all the airports to put out flyers to remind pilots not to fly into Vegas and find themselves with F-16s off their wings. It runs, there's both an adult program and a cadet program. The cadets actually play a very real role in a lot of our search and rescue operations as well. So got involved, been flying with CAP for a number of years, and currently a command mission pilot. Overall, I've got about 4,300 hours of flight time. Fly about 150 hours a year for Civil Air Patrol, so that's generally considered a lot. Flown 122 actual real world search and rescue missions, 42 finds where we found the aircraft or found the individual, and got credited with 14 saves, including 6 here in California. So, and then I developed the curriculum we'll be walking through tonight, and how we train actually our mission air crew, and literally wrote the book on how we do it. So anyway, so tonight what I'm going to do is walk you through a little bit about what ELTs are, the types of beacons that are actually factored rather prominently, how they operate, how the actual infrastructure of how we do search and rescue in the United States operates. And we'll talk about some of the techniques we use on the aircrew side, as well as what's done on the ground. All right, and just a picture on the left there, you see these kind of 2 stickers. Those are every time, sort of like, you imagine World War II, you get a swastika on the side of your P-51 every time you shot down a German. Those are saves. So our aircraft, you can see the number of saves or finds each aircraft has from its crews on the sides of the aircraft. So this is one of our aircraft here in the Bay Area. Has 2 saves, and the picture on the right was my crew after we came back from one of the recent ones. We found a downed airplane in the Sierras, and they were able to, National Park Service was able to go and rescue the pilot, who thankfully only had to spend 1 night on the side of a mountain. So does anybody know why ELTs are required on aircraft in the United States? And there's a quota. Congress mandated it, yes, but why did they do it? They don't do things unless they're forced to sometimes. And it's you can see the quote up there. Aircraft regulations are written in blood. So
Somebody died.
does anybody know what the specific tragedy that took place right here in Northern California is? Okay, good. I'll have the next 3 slides will actually be worth covering then. Okay, it's the legacy of Carla Corbus. She was a 15-year-old. She and her parents were flying from Oregon to San Francisco on March 11th, 1967. They crashed up near Mount Shasta due to poor weather, about 8 miles from a freeway, under a major airway. So those are the big sort of like corridors that airliners and air traffic generally flies through. Due to the fact that they were off course because of the storm, so they filed a flight plan, they did everything right. And the fact that there's really not a lot of radar coverage in the interior of the United States, the search people that did go out basically were looking in the wrong area. And due to the heavy terrain and the snow on the ground, they were not able to leave the crash site. So the family survived the crash. Carla kept a journal, and you can see one of the pages from her journal where she's kind of goading the search and rescue people. The family survived for 54 days before they finally perished due to starvation.
Oh my God.
The remains were found by hunters in October later that year. The journal was recovered, and it so moved and horrified people when they read the journal that they compelled Congress to act. And in 1970, they passed a law that required that all civilian aircraft be equipped with a ELT by 1972. And great question. Thank you, Mr. Segway. What is an ELT and how does it work? So an ELT stands for emergency locator transmitter. They are automatic, right? So they tend to be activated with around 9 Gs of force. though they've been known to, if you have a particularly bad landing, that you can activate them under those conditions too. They can be in the VHF and or the UHF, and we'll talk about sort of some of the differences there. And they're generally mounted in the tail of the aircraft, right? So you can see this is what they actually, sort of the yellow box right there, that's typically what they look like. They're typically brightly colored for reasons that you can actually find them in the wreckage. And if you want to pull them out, a lot of them will actually have a separate antenna strapped to the side of them, so you can actually take them out of the aircraft and you plug them in. They on the antenna on the left there, kind of the taller one, that's the more traditional, the older legacy ELTs that were VHF only. The one on the right is a GPS antenna at the base, as well as a VHF antenna at the top, and then you can see sort of a mounting location and the empennage of an aircraft on the right. And so there are two types. The original sort of analog beacons, which you still find in large number. The United States is one of the few countries where you're still allowed to fly with them. Pretty much every other country has moved to the new ones by law. But we love our nostalgia here. So it typically transmits a continuous audio signal. The frequency is 121.5 if you're a civilian, or 243 megahertz, or also known as GARD if you're in the military. About 100 milliwatts. The battery is sized such that it has to be able to broadcast at sub-freezing temperatures for at least a minimum of 24 hours. Most of them will broadcast for up to 4 days. No problem. The modern ones, which are quite exciting and have completely revolutionized the world of search and rescue, are a combination of VHF, UHF. They do a couple interesting things. One is, by law, you have to register. If you have the new type, you have to register it with NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, because they now transmit an ID code. So there's a data burst that transmits both an ID, so we know whose beacon it is, as well as, in most cases, a latitude and longitude, which is good to plus or minus 100 yards. That hex data burst is not continuous. It's once every 50 seconds, though there's a slight and an intentional random number generator. So it could be 47 to 52 seconds. The reason is, if you have multiple beacons going off, they don't want them all happening in sequence. And so they have slight delays or slight advancements in there so that you can have multiple beacons going off in parallel. The data beacon, the data side that bursts is once every 50 seconds, as I mentioned. That's in the UHF spectrum. It's 406. There's 19 channels in the 406 spectrum that are dedicated to this. In addition, there is a low power short range 1 to 1.5, because obviously if you're trying to home in on a signal that's only broadcasting once every 50 seconds, it's going to be hard to kind of get an angle. So you get a low power transmitter at the same time. These are substantially more powerful. They broadcast the data burst is at 5 watts, and the homing signal is at 50 milliwatts. So pretty interesting stuff. And the system, or we'll talk about the other kind of flavors here. So marine, if you're on a boat, you'll have something called an EPIRB, which stands for Emergency Position Indicated Radio Beacon, because apparently boaters like longer acronyms. It is almost the same thing as an ELT, but instead of being activated by a G-force, they typically are mounted on the railings or on the top of the superstructure. And so as the boat sinks, they are released by water pressure. So they'll float to the top. Sometimes they'll have a lanyard that'll tie them to the wreckage for a period of time. Other times they might be tied to or attached to a life raft, but they are designed to transmit. And they are mandatory on commercial vessels, I think beyond like 30 feet or something like that. And a lot of boaters will carry them too. So same thing, same frequencies as an ELT. They're just used on boats. Military has pilots and air crew will carry similar kinds of beacons. And I've got one up here. You want to flip over to the other account. So this is one of the more of the legacy. This one's issued to aircrew if you're flying in a part of the world where you're not expecting hostile attention. And so basically it has two things. So this one has, in addition to the 406 beacon, here's the GPS you can see at the very top, massive D-cell batteries, because why not? And but it also has a built-in HT, and so you can broadcast, you can talk on 243 or 121.5, and effectively pretty powerful. If you flip back to the slides for a second. Oh, so much power. All right. Awesome. Thank you. All right. So the other ones you see in this picture on the left right here, these are built into ejection seats. So if you punch out, they automatically activate. So at least know where the ejection seat is. Most pilots have a tendency. Sorry. Since most air crew have a tendency to black out during an ejection, it at least gets us an initial signal to know that somebody had to get out of an aircraft. The one in the middle is the kind of Vietnam era, but you still see some pilots, not military, carrying them around. The two on the right are the modern ones. They're actually interesting because they'll broadcast the 4.6, but they also have the ability to securely transmit text messages back and forth. So you can, which is a much easier way. So what's called LPI messaging, or low probability of intercept, low probability of detection. So you can send an entire message as a text message in a millisecond. Yeah, or not necessarily. You can send it via satellite, or it can be picked up by any aircraft that has the decoding equipment on board. And so as a civilian, you too can be cool, and you can have your own beacon. You can actually get them built into watches if you want to spend about $19,000 they're gorgeous watches though, but they are massive. But then you can also buy PLBs, and this is the cheapest life insurance policy if you spend any time in the outdoors, or you're pilot, or just you're backpacker. This is like one of the cheapest things. There are other things you can buy from Garmin and so forth. All of them require a subscription. These are paid for once you bought it, and change the battery every 5 years. Search and rescue is provided because of your tax dollars. So I've got an example up here if you want to flip back over again. They got a couple here actually. Yeah, that's right. About as simple as can be. You flip up the antenna, you hit the big red button, it gets a GPS lock, usually under 30 seconds. Now, all these are designed to transmit to a satellite constellation, which is probably one of the best examples of international space cooperation. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But normally I would do a demonstration right now, and we'd walk outside, I'd hit the test button, and I get a text message. You can see it going all the way through the entire infrastructure. Unfortunately, the server that the company that allows you to do those tests and get the text message and do the demo, they ended that service last year. So, but it takes about 5 minutes, which is pretty cool if you think about that. You're transmitting a position and a message like SOS, goes through an entire international constellation of satellites. Could be American satellite, Russian, Chinese, number of countries are part of this conglomerate. Downlinks to a ground station, to a bridge, sends a text message in under 5 minutes. If you're way up towards the poles, it can sometimes take as long as 15 minutes because of the density satellites, but down here we do pretty well. Right, so back to sharing. ACR sells them. I think they're anywhere, like if you wait to get like the sales, I think they're like $300. So, all right. So again, same thing. You've registered this, so we know. And in fact, if you look on any of these, when you come up here, you can see there's a sticker that you get from the government, which is, you've registered. So the first thing that happens when it goes off is they call me. If they can't get a hold of me, they call my emergency contact numbers. And if they can't get a hold of any of my contacts, then we start to assess it as a real world situation. Because in the past, the old ELTs, which are only 1 to 1.5 with no identifying information, 97% of activations were false alarms. Oh. Right. And that was incredibly problematic because like somebody like me who volunteers, like we get a call, I might be in the middle of the night, we might go into very dangerous conditions. We're risking our lives for what often was like, oh, I was doing maintenance on my plane and forgot that, I kicked to the side of the panel or something like that. Yes, sir. Yeah, so Silver Air Patrol has a whole network of repeaters, and those are used for coordination. So air crew, ground teams, for any of our missions, it's the communications network. and we have special radios in the planes. We can even run encryption if we need to. So, all right. So now that we've talked about the types of ELTs, let's talk a little bit about, I'm going to play some sounds so you can hear them. And the cool thing here is I've done this enough that I can actually tell which brand and model, or not model, but which generation they are based on the sound. But just so you too can enjoy these things wailing. So here we go. So here's your original classic series. Or is that coming over the? Okay.
No.
And this is the modern 406. This is the homing signal that you get with the 406 ones. You're a little bit more digitally sounded there. And then these are the ones that are built into the PLBs. A little higher tone.
We're not hearing it.
Oh, you guys aren't?
No, we don't get it on Zoom. Maybe you could hold the mic next to your PC speakers.
Wait, so reshare and do what? Aha. Excellent. All right, just for the folks at home.
Okay.
All right, and now the modern one. Okay, and one more. This is the one that are built into the portable beacons. All right.
Wow. That'll get your attention.
This stupid presentation.
Oh, yes. Well said. So how does the infrastructure work? As I mentioned, there's a whole constellation of satellites. This was a program started in the 1970s, first with the Soviet Union and the United States got together, then France, Canada, a number of other countries signed on eventually over time. Basically, governments, including on their GPS, communications, Earth observation satellites like GOES, effectively a package that listens for signals. And up for 30 years, they were listening for 1 to 1.5 and using Doppler shift and some other techniques to identify where that signal was coming from. Today, because they're only listening for 406, it's a much faster system, much more accurate because they're also being able to pick up the digital signal and downlink it to the ground. And so effectively what happens is, yes, go ahead. Yes. They can, because some of there are 406 beacons that didn't, or because like if it's an ELT in an aircraft, some of them have to actually pull the position from the aircraft. And if for whatever reason in the crash, it didn't get, it wasn't being updated on the data link. Well, if you're getting a signal, you'll get the GPS because it'll have the last position. The ELTs are designed so they take the last position before the aircraft, the power went off, and they continually transmit that. So effectively, there's this constellation of satellites. There are multiple ground stations around the world. So in the code, the hex code that actually transmits the first 3 digits actually define the country. So 366 to 369 would be the United States. And then there's an identifier, and then there's a coordination. So effectively, this gets downlinked to the ground and routed to the correct rescue coordination center. In the United States, Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida is where the Air Force Rescue Coordination Center is located. The Air Force takes all these signals, and then once they've determined that it's a legit search, so if my beacon goes off, something comes up on an operator's terminal, we did the tour down there. Effectively, with my information, they make a call to me. They can't get a hold of me. They call them the next contact number. So my second contact happens to be a fellow search and rescue pilot here, and he and I do the exact same thing. If I'm out flying, he knows that I'm actually going flying. So if he gets a call, he says, "Yes, that's a legit." Whoops. Oh, got it. Sorry. Local sheriff search and rescue teams get their notification that a beacon has been activated through Cal OES state warning stations that after the beacon has been active for more than 2 hours. So Cal OES only gets it if the Air Force sends it to them. So the Air Force decides which agency will take it. And in the United States, usually if it's over water, it's the Coast Guard. If it's more than usually about 2 miles offshore, If it's inland, Civil Air Patrol is usually here in California is the prime agency that gets the calls first. And we actually rotate who is the watch officer for getting those calls from the Rescue Coordination Center.
Oh, no.
Somebody with a question? Okay. Anyway, so signal comes down, the AFRCC decides, okay, it's in the state of California. They call the watch officer, and then they start to take action from there. Sometimes if it's on an airport, they call the airport first, and they'll be like, hey, can you drive up and down the airfield trying to listen for, and almost every airfield has a monitoring station for listening for ELTs. They go off because of maintenance. They go off because people let the batteries wind down and they'll activate. So unfortunately, there's a number of reasons why they activate when they shouldn't be activating. All right, so the 1215 and the 243 signals are no longer monitored. However, pretty much every airliner, and most pilots, when I'm flying around, I usually have one of my radios set for 1215, just monitoring it. So if I pick one up, you report it to air traffic control. The airliners are awesome about it. They usually report it multiple, if they're not getting hit on the satellite, multiple hits on a 1215 signal, they'll start to, they load that into, AFRCC will load that into their software, and they can do a bit of a triangulation exercise to sort of narrow down a search area. See here. So just giving you an idea of how it used to work, if the satellites picked up a 1215 signal, they could usually get it down to about a search area of only 452 square miles. Usually they would, by itself in the United States, at least, there's plenty of airliners usually in the airspace. And so they would get multiple reports from lower altitude, and they would usually use the airliners at between 20 and 40,000 feet to help narrow the search box. If you're using a 406, but without a location, they can narrow that down to about 12.5 square miles. And then if it's a 406 with sending the GPS coordinates, then it's just plus or minus 100 meters. So it's more, less searching, more finding is the idea. And this just gives you an idea of so the GOES, which are sit in geosynchronous orbit, you can see how much larger these big yellow boxes, their area over they're basically the area of visibility they have on the ground versus the low Earth orbit in red. Gives you an idea of just how much smaller. So the LEO satellites are able to get really on their first pass, usually get a first order narrowing down. All right, so let's talk a little bit about how we actually go look for these things. So, I get a call, they're asked to go. The first thing we usually do is we're given a kind of a position, a last known position where we're going to fly to that area. We're going to gain altitude, which is our friend. Usually we do these searches between 3,000 and 6,000 feet. And then as soon as we've picked it up, we start to use a series of techniques to narrow it down. If we don't just have an ELT location where we have a latitude and longitude, in which case we'll just fly to that point, then we need to actually start using direction finding techniques. So things that you would usually deal with, multipath, bounces off of mountains. Power lines, especially high tension power lines, can be horrific. So helicopters have a tendency to crash right at the base of power lines because they tend to hit power lines. And then those power lines will radiate that signal in weird ways for miles. We actually, up to 100 miles away from an actual crash site, we were picking up an ELT. So just give you an idea that this isn't as straightforward. That's why I said it's art and science of this. So it's all line of sight, of course. So there's a couple techniques we use. One of them is to use just the onboard radios on the aircraft, and we use wing shadowing, right? So, using your body on the ground, you can just sort of rotate around if you're doing a fox hunt. We do the same thing, right? So the antennas are mounted on most of the aircraft we fly are mounted on the top of the aircraft, right? So we go into a bank that's steep enough where you can actually use the wings to actually block the signal. We listen for the null, and then depending upon if the antennas are on the top or the bottom of the aircraft, you either subtract or add 90 degrees to the heading. Generally, we don't do a whole lot of flying at this angle, but it proves a point that's useful for illustration. And you look for where you get your null. And so in the case of where you have the antennas mounted on the top of the aircraft, you basically, if I'm in the left seat, I've got a crew member who's called a mission observer. Their job is to run navigation system, the communication systems, and they're sort of the mission commander. They're responsible for the mission objectives. I'm responsible for operating the aircraft safely. And so they'll be the ones looking at the heading, listening for when the signal fades, and then adding or subtracting a heading 90 degrees to the heading, depending upon where the antennas are mounted in the aircraft. In this case, you can see the NavCom antennas on Cessnas. They're actually a combination of VHF plus GPS antenna. All right. So that's technique number one. Technique number two is a little bit more advanced, but it's the RO method. And this works better in Kansas and flat places where you assume that the signal is effectively radiating in a circular pattern in all directions. It doesn't work so well here in California or any place pretty much west of Colorado. So effectively what we're looking to do here, and looks like a calculus exam, is fly a pattern in different directions and then listen for the signal to fade. And then you draw a series of chords to triangulate the position from there. A bit more complex, but in areas where you do get an even signal radiation, it is actually pretty effective, especially if in the old days when we had to cover much larger search areas on the 1215 signals. The third technique that we use, then I'll just cover this. So the cone of silence, or the receptions, as you pass over the signal, obviously you lose it. And so one of the techniques that I teach is, I call it the falling clover leaf, is effectively we can pass over the signal, we wait for it to fade out. As we continue to fly along, we pick up the signal again. I usually start a descent, and turning descent, usually about 270-degree turn. We fly back over at a different altitude, and as we decrease, as we descend, we decrease the level of area over the ground that the signal could be coming from. In fact, the charts, one of the things I did that apparently nobody had done before is I went out one day and I flew over one of our practice beacons, and we actually went off and recorded with the number of aircraft, effectively at what altitude can you pick up the signal and how big of a search area are you from that signal. So if you're a certain altitude, you picked up a signal at a certain strength, you are X nautical miles from that source. And then you can see here, similar thing where you look at signal strength and altitude to give you a sense of how far you are from the signal's location. Now, one of the things that's happened, of course, these techniques are very interesting. They require a little bit more technique, but in modern aircraft, in some of we have a new modern system that actually makes this a little bit easier. So this is the cockpit of one of our aircraft. It's a glass cockpit G1000. So you got the screens for, the aircraft systems. And then right over here on the right-hand side, you see this kind of this round dial. And this is what we call the Rotheta or the Becker. It's a German company that produces direction finding equipment. You'll find some variation of this in pretty much every law enforcement aircraft and many military aircraft. And they make this technique a little bit easier. So on the front, you have the display control unit. On the right, you have the solid state antenna that gets mounted in the belly of the airplane. And there you go. There you can see on the tail just below the registration number there. And effectively what it does is it gives you a nice readout where it's comparing the signal strength and giving you a heading relative to the aircraft's heading. So it's not saying, so like on the left there, it's not telling me to turn right to 002. It's just saying it's 2 degrees to the right of the nose of the aircraft. And effectively what you see there is the black dot, which you see at the top of this arc, is the heading that's telling you. So it's done some averaging and saying that's where. And then the two sort of white dots you see on either side is the margin of error, right? So it's giving you a sense of how strong the signal is and how confident it is in that bearing. So if you're bouncing all over the place, you know that you're dealing with multipath, you're dealing with poor signal quality. It might be inside of a building. And so forth. And then as you get closer and closer, usually we start on the left where it's a 360-degree representation around the aircraft. As you get closer and closer and you want a little bit more finite flying, the one on the middle gives you a little bit more sensitivity. Or if you just want big numbers, you can use the one on the right. Now, certainly we could sit here and say, hey, this is cool. Why didn't you just start here and instead of using all those other techniques we just talked about? Well, the simple reason is this is a great system, but it doesn't really come into use until you're pretty close to the aircraft or pretty close within a few miles. There are techniques that we can use. So we use the fading and aural method. For example, a lot of times I'll pull squelch on the radio so I can hear the signal much further out before it'll start to break squelch on our communications radios, or before the signal is even strong enough to start twitching on the Becker. In cases where it's a 406 signal where there's a data block, this is the screen that we get where it'll actually decipher the code for us. So you can see, here we are, the country code, 257 is Germany. So, they're made in Germany. So that's why we're seeing it there. You see the squelch level, which is automatically set by the system. You get the latitude and longitude right here, which is great because I can now just plug that straight into the nav system and fly to those low coordinates. And then we can actually see the complete hexadecimal message here. So that's what's basically being transmitted. And if you look on the side of these, if you come up later, you can actually see the sticker, and that's the entire hex code that my beacon's transmitting if I activate it. For those who really want to nerd out on specs, this is the sensitivity that the Becker has. It is, like I said, it does do a very good job, but I can often hear the signal on the navigation radios or the communications radios far in advance of the Becker starting to take action. So all the techniques we're talking about tonight, the wing nulling, the RL fade build method, they're all usable. They're all useful, and you use them in conjunction one with another before you get in here and we get to use the cool high-tech gadgets. All right. So talked a little bit about this. This gives you an example of altitude versus signal strength versus distance. So this is very helpful to say, hey, are we getting warmer? Are we getting warmer? If you're starting to have issues actually detecting it, a lot of times we'll climb a little bit and see if we can get a better signal, and then descend again to try and get closer. All right. So I'll give you an example. This is a mission I flew a couple years ago up in the state of Washington. We were getting an ELT. It was in a valley. We're getting all sorts of weird multipath. We started to home in on that. We found the plane. This is a Cirrus. For those who don't know, Cirrus aircraft actually have a rocket-powered parachute that comes out of the back of the aircraft if you get into trouble. Fortunately, this pilot thought he could stretch, he'd run out of fuel, and he was trying to stretch the glide into this field that's about over to the right-hand side of where this picture is. Clipped those trees, went head down, and unfortunately, he was deceased. There was nobody home, and this is a farm out kind of in a remote area, but the passenger who was on board the aircraft, a young woman who was not his wife. She did survive. Not his daughter either. So what happened? So now you've found it, right? We got a good strong signal. If it's located, if it's located on an airfield as an aircrew, we might be able to land and go investigate further. If it's off the airfield, we have Civil Air Patrol actually has ground teams, which are, might take them a while to get there. So, when you're flying along at 135 knots, you can get to a location much faster than a ground team in their van. Or we often work with local law enforcement. Sometimes we'll call them because there is obviously limitations. As an extension of the Air Force, Posse Comitatus is in effect. So we can't be law enforcement. We can't enter private property. We have to use law enforcement to do those techniques. So this is giving you an example. We landed at this airfield. This is a colleague of mine. The pad is trying to verify whether it's this hangar. Yep, so we can definitely tell it's coming from that behind you. And so this was the aircraft we found. We found it was going through maintenance, and sure enough, in the course of maintenance, the mechanic had accidentally activated it. It was like it had been blasting all weekend long. Hangars are really interesting because from a radio propagation, they tend to be very directional right out the door. And so you start getting really good at figuring out where the orientation of all the hangars are on an airfield because you only get signals certain ways. Yes, sir, in the back. They do. You're supposed to, every time before you shut the airplane down, you're supposed to turn to the frequency and listen to it. In the more modern aircraft, there's actually a light that'll flash that'll tell you about it, like if it's actually tied into the avionics system. But for the most part, these are mounted in a part of the aircraft where there's, you wouldn't be back there. There's usually in a rear compartment where the propagation of the sound would be minuscule, especially on larger aircraft.
Hey, Josh, because we have Zoom people, they didn't get to hear that question. Can you just repeat it?
Yeah, absolutely. The question was, if false alarms are so frequent, why wouldn't they have some sort of indicating system like a beeper or sound on the beacon itself to let you know that the beacon is activated?
Thank you.
Okay. And so that was the beacon that we pulled out of that one. This gives you an idea. So this was a more recent one here in California. This is Auburn, up in Auburn. So we got a signal, we flew. All right, here we are. I think this is the aircraft. It's a Katana U-20A1, N227 Papa. And if we've got the radio here on 1216, been detuned and without an antenna. Good idea. We're pretty certain it was that airplane. Got Gabe.
Oftentimes you're so close to the ELT that if you set it off, you'll hear it on whatever frequency you were on.
And ELTs, by the way, are also designed to be somewhat noisy spectrally. So they will chatter across, so they're not spectrally pure, but that's intentional so that you get a lot of weird harmonics, so that there's a greater likelihood that they're detected. So that's kind of one of the weird ones. One on the right here, this was kind of a fun one. This was out of Byron in the Bay Area. And I'm sticking my radio into the hangar. What we didn't know at the time was the plane was stolen. And so
definitely
it's stolen from another airfield,
so we're looking
and
at
parked in that hangar.
E3 here at Byron.
It wasn't until the law enforcement came out there and made entry that they were able to determine that the tail number had been reported stolen. All right, here we are. So the other thing that we have are ground teams, and these are mostly where the cadet program really comes into effect, where they get trained and certified to go out and do searches. And so the gentleman on the left is holding one of our called ELPers. These are the handheld DFing equipment, which I was going to have one here tonight. Unfortunately, there's a big exercise tomorrow, and so they're all in use. But you can see here, for example, is a ground team out on an exercise. And they're trying to narrow it down. You can hear the aircraft over as they're starting to look for signs. We have practice or on 121775. So like we don't actually transmit on the real frequency. This gives you an example of kind of another mission. This was up in Washington. You can see Mount Rainier there. This is the radar track of the aircraft. And Civil Air Patrol, and we'll talk a little bit about this in a second, but Civil Air Patrol actually runs the National Radar Forensics Team. They're a group of volunteers that are experts and basically from home and doing radar analysis. And usually in less than an hour, they can, because effectively the way it works, I know most people are maybe not familiar with this. So we have transponders on our aircraft that send out a signal when they get interrogated. But if you don't happen to be close to some place like an airfield or here in the Bay Area where there's multiple centers that are constantly pinging your things, if you happen to get out into a rural area, there is radars, but they're not actually looking at, you're getting what's called the skin paint. They're bouncing it off the aircraft, but nobody's really monitoring which aircraft is which. They don't know. So people have to go back and do the forensics and identify which of those tracks, those little signals, is likely the aircraft in question. And so in this particular case, this guy was trying to scud run, which is flying under a storm, which is always a bad idea, and discovered that mountains don't move. And so in this case, I'll show you, there's the ELT. It actually did not activate, but we tested it immediately upon finding it. It was fine, but for some reason, it was more than 9 Gs, I can guarantee you that. But and weirdly, he had like 50 pounds of dog food on board, which I had no idea why. And that was the cause of his crash right there. No. There you go. Sad. All right. So let's talk a little bit about, so I mentioned a second ago that CAP also is involved in this, is kind of another aspect of sort of how radio and RF can help people say, but let's say there's not a beacon because they don't always activate. How else might we find an aircraft? And that's where the national forensics teams, both for cell phone as well as for radar, come into play. And they've built a series of tools. It used to take painstaking hours. The FAA does this. It can take up to 6 hours for them to reconstruct the radar track. These guys can do it in like less than an hour. And so they're all volunteers. And these are all the radar stations that exist in the United States, right? So they can pull in this, they can extract the data. They're given permission by the FAA when there's an actual mission. And you can get a sense of how long it takes for typical analysis, like 3 hours and 17 minutes. And the NRAT team can do the same thing in under 40 minutes. So they're pretty good at this. This gives you an idea of how many, so the Air Force Rescue Coordination Center, how many finds they were credited between 2009 and 2016, and how many saves they were responsible for in actually bringing people home. Just to give you an idea of how this works, they identify where the track was, the departure point, the arrival point. They pull those radars. This is sort of some of the raw data, and then they start to reconstruct the likely path of the aircraft from those signals. They start getting a better analysis. You can see sort of this red-green path there. And then what they do is they start overlaying, looking at, like, here's that same track plotted on an aviation chart or an aircraft chart. So to get a sense of where what the airspace may have been, what the terrain was like. They can apply weather. So to get an idea of, like, what were the weather conditions? Did they hit icing conditions, which may have affected the plane? And then they can also look at how the terrain was. So you can see that line for the aircraft, anything that's yellow is within 500 feet of the aircraft's altitude, and anything that's red should be like within 100 feet or above. Like purple would be like you're a submarine at that point. But you can have a sense that this plane was flying at a constant altitude into rising terrain, which is generally a bad idea. And here's what it looks like in a 3D sense. And that gives me an idea as a pilot where I can start looking, and you can see that he started around. He might have started to make a turn, realizing that he was kind of perhaps based on the weather that we saw, the weather slide, looks like he was flying into a storm, realized that maybe this is not something he wanted to do, started to make a turn. Perhaps he was in the clouds. And if he's a non-instrument rated pilot, typically once they fly into clouds, their life expectancy is under 60 seconds. So they tend to lose control of the airplane pretty quickly. So, and that appears to be here. He went into what's called the death spiral, and we found him. You can see the blue dots here, where the blue dots intercept the ground. And that's ultimately when you see he was in a rapid descent, but in a spiraling sense. Because what happens if you can't see outside the airplane, when people say fly by the seat of your pants, it's actually a bad idea. Your ass is usually lying to you, because G forces will make you feel like you're sitting in a 1G flight, sort of stable wings level attitude, where you're actually in an accelerating spiral in a 1G turn. And that's generally what happens. Your inner ear lies to you, your butt lies to you, and then the ground doesn't lie to you. Yes, sir.
Wait a second.
We got 33 people on Zoom that want to hear your question.
I realize that your inner ear and everything is lying to you, but what about the gauges on your plane? Even though you might be not instrument rated, can't you tell what your attitude is and if you're climbing or not?
You definitely, assuming the plane is operating correctly, yes. But when people are stressed out and panicking, the rational part of the brain of looking for the instruments goes away. Yeah. All right. So just kind of wrapping up here, great team. They are volunteers. They do some pretty amazing stuff. We work with them very closely to get the data that we need, so that when we go on the mission, we know where to go. So with that, I'll conclude. It's kind of our ongoing joke: support, search and rescue, get lost. And thank you very much. I'll take questions.
Oh, just kind of an add-on to what you were saying. I was routinely flying out to steakhouses from the Palo Alto airport. We'd go to different places, and this guy was instrument rated, and we had a number of different problems. But the one that wasn't a problem, well, we were coming back from Jonesy's in Vallejo, and we ran into some clouds, and there was this moment when, he glanced at the front panel, and he's like, "Oh no, we're in a dive." We pulled up, everything was okay, but you really don't know it. You're just kind of staring out the window blissfully, and he just kind of glanced back at the dashboard, and he's like, "Oh, uh-oh." Another time we had a radio failure, and we knew it was failing when we got to the steakhouse. This was also Jonesy's in Vallejo. When we got there, it was failing. And so he was able to go to the payphone at the airport there and call back to Palo Alto and say, "Well, we're going to be coming in with a broken radio." And so then when we were just about over the Dumbarton Bridge, we saw these flashes coming out of the tower, and it was like one flash for come in or two for turn around, circle. And I forget what the code was, but I think it was 2 flashes, and we did come in for landing. But you do get failures, and it's pretty weird.
Daryl had a question.
It's interesting on this talk. I actually watched the documentary on Malaysian flight MH370, That's the one they can't find. And one of the things that they used was satellite data from MRSat. They had to, I mean, obviously mathematically, they actually used the latency of the pings because the satellite terminal on the plane apparently was returning pings, but of course Doppler. And it's interesting that they figured out that the plane either had to go north or south of Kuala Lumpur. And interesting that they just can't find that plane. That, you know, I don't know if anything has changed in aviation as a result of that, that now when pings are done, they send back GPS data or not. But I just thought this was interesting that the only real data they had was the MRSat data from that flight.
Well, so over what's, you know, basically the big swaths of the planet, like the Pacific. So several years ago, I had the opportunity to fly around the world with a friend. It was the first circumnavigation where you landed at all 7 continents. So we kind of got to write our name in the history books. But when you're over the Atlantic and you're over the Pacific for these swaths, there is nobody tracking you. There's no radar. There's no satellite. You call in on the HF at certain reporting points, and you tell them where you'll be on the next reporting point, when you'll be there, and you basically it's all self-reporting. And by the way, if you're flying across the Atlantic on an airliner, on a United or American Airlines, it's doing the same thing. Now, what's coming in now more and more is after the Malaysia flight, a lot of these, because the airlines didn't want to pay for it, they started to pay for the satellite subscriptions to send regular pings back as well. So you can have an onboard system like kind of the Garmin, the not eTrax. What's the Garmin system? I can't remember it. InReach, thank you. Similar to that, that's using the Iridium system, Iridium's constellation, or something similar. And Starlink's put out a really cool system now as well for aircraft. So probably using that. No, I mean, once you get over the Pacific, you find not as many airlines offer that service over the Pacific Atlantic because it gets really expensive. Cool. Yes, sir. In the back.
Yes, you have. So the senior squadron you guys are flying is still out of Oakland Airport?
No, there's multiple squadrons. There's one in Palo Alto, San Jose. I've got what 4 on the west side, or 3 on the west side, and 5 squadrons on the east side.
You're speaking about flying teams or aircraft with the seniors and observers. Is that what
Yeah,
you're
so
talking about?
we typically fly with a crew of 3. You have a mission pilot, a mission observer who runs who sits in the front right seat, and then we typically in the back seat have a scanner. So when we're actually doing the observation or looking for like a target, the scanner is the one that sort of eyes out the most on that too, and also the photographer taking pictures from the air of the target.
Yes, thank you. I'm familiar with that. I was wondering, you mentioned 8 aircraft. Is that Northern California that represented, and other those corporate aircraft or other?
Oh, I mean, in the state, like, so I'm just talking about the group, like the
No,
Bay
no, no.
Area.
Just like I'm thinking maybe group 2, but I didn't know if you were referring to those. You mentioned number 8 before. I don't know if that was.
So we have 5 aircraft in group 2.
5, is that right?
Which is the Bay Area.
Are those all corporate aircraft?
Yes. Yeah, there's no, CAP doesn't, the only aircraft that CAP owns are corporate aircraft that we fly anymore.
In the old days, I guess we used volunteer aircraft as well.
Yeah, we stopped doing that like a couple decades ago.
Yeah, well, shows you how old I am. At any rate,
it's okay. It's easier to maintain our fleet than, you never know who's been doing the maintenance. The Alaska wing was the last one that was still using private aircraft.
I understand. And did you want to mention anything about recruiting for CAP, or is that too far for you to go?
If folks want, I'm happy to talk about it. I just didn't want to make it a recruiting event. That's all.
I'll just mention that the letters CAP stand for come and pay.
Yeah.
Because you have to pay for your own uniforms and all that stuff. But it's a lot of fun. So I just want to make a CAP.
Cadets, the youth program gets their uniforms for free. So I will say that. It's just the adults because, we figure you have a job.
That's right. Well, thank you for the great work.
Awesome. Any other questions? Anybody on the line?
Yeah, we do have a question. I'll give it over to Ben here.
Okay.
So the question is essentially, if you need to contact CAP yourself, is there a way to do that?
Why would you be contacting CAP yourself?
Josh, I'd ask that questions because I'm a pilot myself. We had, a friend go down some time back in Arizona. We knew he was missing. And, the first thought was to call CAP basically. So, those situations, what's the best way to get a hold of somebody?
CAP is probably not the place you should call your law enforcement first. Or the Air Force Rescue Coordination Center, because they have the national. So like, we're not allowed. So like, if you told me, hey, this plane, my friend just took off, unless I saw it or I'm hearing the signal, even if I'm like out flying for myself and I pick up an ELT, I'm not allowed to go self dispatch on a mission. It has to do with liability, lawyers get involved, all the fun goes out the window. But effectively, like because it is considered a law enforcement or a public safety thing, it has to be under the auspices of the state or the US government so like the best thing to do is call law enforcement, say, hey, plane is overdue, or call the tower, say plane is overdue, my friend has gone out, they've not returned, or you can call the Air Force Rescue Coordination Center, the number is online. So those would be your first, but as opposed to calling CAP, because like you call me and there's nothing a whole lot I can do about it. But when I'm up in the air flying and I pick up an ELT, I do exactly the same thing. I just report it to air traffic control. Now, sometimes it works in my favor where I can be like, I'm in a CAP aircraft, I'm in uniform, I got a crew with me. And like, by the time that we can fly along, then we'll get like just tasks while we're in the air to go take care of it. But like, there is a policy involved in, so the best thing to do, call law enforcement, call the local tower, report it to them, because then they can get the full weight of like the whole system working in your favor.
Got it. Thanks, Josh. That's great information. Thank you.
Anybody else online? Okay, in the back, gentleman in the back.
Oh, okay. What types of aircraft are you flying mostly?
For CAP, the most predominant aircraft here is the 182, the Cessna 182, but we also have 206s and turbo 206s, and we have a couple 172s that we use for flight instruction for the cadets. Other parts of the country have Mollies and the Griffin up in Alaska. All right.
Okay, any other questions in the room? And one last chance for all our Zoomites out there. Please put it in the text, or if you can make it obvious with one of the little hand gestures perhaps. But
for folks here, if you're interested in coming up, I also brought my survival kit, so you can see kind of the stuff, the gear we fly in. But then there's some example beacons here that you can take a look at. Just please don't activate.
I think I don't see anything. Josh, thank you so much. But hang on to that for a second. So as you know, he was a little late, but this is impressive story here, folks. Like me, we serve the public as a paramedic in his Civil Air Patrol duties. Why were you late?
Oh, I told him I stopped on the side of 280 after seeing a rollover.
There you go. Always serving the public. All right. Thank you so much. Very interesting and informational. We had like 34 on Zoom and we have 30 something here. So 30, thank you. 38. So thank you very much. I'm sure they all enjoyed it. Let me throw it back over to Jim and tell us what's up next.
Awesome job. Thank you very much for your service as well.